So thanks everybody for coming. We're going to talk about software sustainability, discoverability, and accreditation today. We have Leslie and Mike here in the audience as well, who we kind of put two sessions together and turned it into this session. So we'll see how this goes. One, I guess just to start off with, this is probably not really much of a surprise to anybody, but I just wanted to throw up a few different statistics about research software. And so there's a few different ways that we can think about why research software is important. One of them is because of funding. One study that we did using some dataset service is that about 20% of NSF projects over an 11-year period topically discussed software in their abstracts. Another way of looking at this is that the Department of Energy has the exascale computing program. Two of the three main areas are research software. So this is a total of about $14 billion that's being spent by the US government in these two programs in these two areas. We think that there's quite a lot more. Another way is to look at publications. Software intensive projects are a majority of current publications, and the most cited papers over the last 10, 20, 30 years are either methods or software papers. So they're the tools that people actually use to do their work. And the last thing is that we just ask researchers, is software important to you? And about 90% of US and UK researchers in two surveys have said that they use research software. 65% couldn't do their research without it, and 50% develop software as part of their research. So open source then in software is also growing. In 2001, we had 208,000 SourceForge users. In 2017, we had 20 million GitHub users. Last year, we had 37 million GitHub users. So this is increasing fairly rapidly. It was also interesting to me to see that in 1998, there were 180,000 downloads of Netscape. I don't know how many people remember Netscape, but it was kind of a nice browser for a while, over a 2-week period. A couple of years ago, there were 21 million downloads of Lodash, a JavaScript library, in 2 weeks. I have no idea what this library does, but it's amazing to me that that this is just one of many libraries that's getting this many downloads in a short period of time. And this is really I think the case for a lot of different software, that there's these huge numbers of things that are important to large numbers of people, and they really get used a lot. The other thing that I wanted to say was a 2018 survey of scientist developers found that 82% said they were spending more time or much more time developing software than they did 10 years ago. So again, software is becoming more important to people and taking more of their time. There's a bunch of different organizations that are interested in this. The Software Sustainability Institute, which probably a number of people have heard of, is funded by all UK research councils and is trying to make sure that UK software is sustainable. There's a group called Better Scientific Software that's Department of Energy funded. It's a clearinghouse to gather and discuss and disseminate a bunch of different things that are intended to help developers be more productive and make software more sustainable. There's the ERSI project that I talked about in the plenary, where we're trying to do something very similar to the SSI in the UK, I would say. There's the Australian Research Data Commons, which is trying to provide access to data-intensive e-infrastructure platform skills and data collections to the Australian research community and industry. And then there's finally something called RISA, the Research Software Alliance, that's trying to coordinate all of the above and other groups that are also interested in software. So there's a bunch of different sets of us that are all interested in these things and trying to work together to make contributions. If we think about software sustainability and what that actually means, I would say that software sustainability is the capability or the capacity of the software to endure. Will the software continue to be available in the future on new platforms meeting new needs? And so you can think of software sustainability as a sufficient change in software state over time. And that's sufficient to deal with software collapse, the software just stopping working because some underlying library stopped working or changed its API, software bugs, and new features that are needed. This change in software state is created by people. And so there's some amount of effort that goes into a project that helps. There's some amount of effort that maybe is needed in order to keep the software working. There's some friction, there's some efficiency. And software stops being sustained when the effort going into the software is less than the effort that's being used actually to use the software over some period of time. And we can think of human effort as kind of like dollars in some sense, kind of like funding, but not exactly. We can have a project that's all human effort, and that works well. That's something like a community open source project. We can have a project that's all funded and has no community piece, like a project that's funded by NASA at a NASA center or a commercial project, and that also works quite well. But when you combine these, it's actually fairly hard often, where you have some people that are being paid to do something and you have some other people that are doing it for free. You get kind of conflicting motivations, conflicting goals, and conflicting willingness to participate in different ways. So again, kind of just thinking about this part, there are a few different things we can do, and this is the reason we have this session, is to think about these things. One of them is to try to change our culture to support community contributions. And we can do this by better measuring people's contributions, by things like prizes, potentially. Maybe there should be some AGU open source prize or some ESIP open source prize or something else that we might want to think about for maybe for biggest contribution to an existing package or biggest or most impactful new package or something else. And we can also think about how we actually take this into consideration in terms of hiring and promotion. The other thing that we also can do is to enable discovery. And so if people are able better to see what software exists and to discover it, that increases the efficiency overall of the system. It reduces re-implementation. Right? You use somebody else's software rather than re-implementing your own version of it. This is particularly a problem in workflow systems, but it shows up in a lot of other places as well. And this also would encourage collaboration, because you might find something that does 99% of what you want, and then you could do the other 1% rather than having to do the whole thing. So overall, in this session, we want to talk about sustainability, discoverability, and accreditation of software. And we're going to start off with a few short talks. I think 4 short talks on sustainability, and then 4 short talks on discovery and accreditation, or some number of short talks. We'll find out. Sorry, this kind of having a conference immediately after the holidays is not the most efficient for scheduling something with people around the world. But just to start off with, then, on this piece, on the sustainability part, let's see, Ben. Okay, so sorry, so
right from there.
Yes.
Could I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Just on this this view of software sustainability, like thinking of it. Thank you. Thinking of it as ecosystem, which you sometimes apply. I was thinking you had the input, output, and the friction. Well, part of that friction might be what happens in terms of the larger software ecosystem within which it fits, and where other softwares may change that are related, or databases or standards. All of that leads to friction, or the less usability of the software within that.
Yes, without any question. Yes. Sorry, and I also should say that it's great to get questions and comments from anybody that's here while we do this. After these short talks we're going to have, then we'll have some breakout sessions. One that'll be focused more on sustainability, and one that'll be focused more on discoverability and accreditation. And so then we can break up into 2 groups and talk about some of these things, hopefully, and take some notes and see what we might do within the ESIP community going forward after this session. So, Ben.
So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is open source community building. And I will assert with zero data that one of the way to assist in the sustainability is if there's a vibrant community around the package, so that you have, it's not just you and your funding sources that are keeping a package alive. And so just the body of my talk is a single slide, which is just a checklist of things that we can all do on any project that we're working on to try to make it welcoming to collaborators that maybe you don't even know, people who are using your software and would have an opportunity to contribute back. So first of all, it's got to be publicly available, that people can actually contribute to the code, and GitHub is now kind of pretty much the de facto way of that gets done. Something that people don't think about until late in projects sometimes is the licensing. And if you don't actually have a proper open source license in your code, then many people can't contribute because it's unclear about the ownership. And so it's good to get that in there. If you want people to contribute, then you need to tell them how to contribute. So a contributor's guide that tells people at least how to expect the workflow to go and what your expectations are for them to contribute. Code of conduct is really important to put in there from the beginning to just set the rules that there's been a lot of study about different cultures that emerge in some open source projects. And it's very interesting, like there are so many projects that people make one contribution and then never come back again. And possibly that's due to a toxic atmosphere that exists within there. Carol Willing from the Jupyter Hub project talks about, she loves seeing projects where the code of conduct is the first commit to their repo. Very important thing is just how easy it is for people to set it up and try it out. You only get one chance where people are coming by and saying, is this something I want to build on, or should I just go build my own thing? And if it takes them longer than 15 minutes to build it, they're probably most people are gonna judge, yeah, I'm just gonna go do my own thing, which is unfortunate. Part of that is continuous integration. And so then that kind of helps you know that your code is always in a state that people can come in and do something useful. But also this is combined with unit tests. Having good unit tests on all of your code gives a contributor a good feeling of knowing, like, okay, if I'm making this contribution to the code, have I broken anything? I'd like to know that before I make a fool of myself and submit something. And then me as a reviewer of a source code base, how do I know whether I should accept this contribution? So unit tests are very good. Having very clear set of issues of what you are looking for help on, and if you can tag things and say, here's a great thing for a first-time developer to come in and contribute, then that helps people find out how to get into the project and become part of it. And then finally, GitHub issues are a great way to communicate, but usually you need something a little more interactive, so like Getter or Slack as a way that you can kind of start having a community. And then these things also help to provide a place where the community exists. So that's all I got. Oh.
So I'd like to make one additional suggestion. Actually, documentation. So I noticed that documentation.
Always forget that.
Yes.
My suggestion is to add maybe one more thing to the checklist of documentation, particularly documentation standards. I mean, if you're building packages in certain frameworks, there's already very easy documentation standards.
Mm-hmm.
And then good examples of documentation, right? Because there's many projects that I've landed on that, I mean, mostly on the library side,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to figure out, where the flow of the library is and where I can make modifications is almost impossible, especially if it's a graduate student project where things are very poorly documented, right? It's I did this for, generally speaking, right? Sometimes they're not. I was not the, anyway, yeah, I was keenly aware of this when I was a graduate student.
Yeah.
The second thing is this available as like a cookie cutter or as a template or something like that? Because that would be also a nice thing that, if you can fork the repository and have already sort of some templates and sketches there, then that makes it relatively easy to then, sort of go through this checklist and see that project is doing sort of the right sort of behavior.
Yeah, I just found out about cookie cutter I helped out the ERSI Winter School in Seattle.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yes, we need to have some best practice projects.
Yeah.
So yes, okay. Uh-oh, my 5 minutes, sir.
No, I was just going to say that there's an organization called MOLSI, which is the Molecular Sciences Software Sustainability Institute, something like that, molssi.org, and they have a cookie cutter page for software. And so I think that's a good place to go at this point for something that has a good set of examples.
Also
the data science community. So there are some data science cookie cutters that basically set up Jupyter Notebook GitHub structures. So that's another example of where you can go for this sort of thing.
Thanks for your presentation, and that's a nice list, but I didn't see governance.
That's right. Yep. I mean, it's
So,
right.
So I guess, sorry, just in the interest of time, I think that maybe this is one of the things we can do in the sustainability breakout is to think about how we could actually turn this into something that's more useful and to add things that are missing. So if that's maybe one idea of of what we could do.
And I was trying to stay under 5 minutes.
You want
That's
to add
good.
right now?
I have that effect.
Okay, so, sorry, so I'm going to do one more thing very quickly, and then we will go to Shelley. Sorry, one more thing really quickly. Okay, so I wanted just to talk briefly about some stuff that's going on in software citation, because again, one of the things that I believe is true is that if we can give people credit for the work that they do in software that fits into the academic system, that'll encourage them to do more of it. And so that's the part of the reason that I'm interested in citation. And so with Neil Chuhong and Martin Fenner, we've been leading a Force 11 software citation implementation working group. But I wanted just to start with that in 2015, we had a Force 11 software citation group that reviewed community practices and developed sort of use cases around software citation. And then it drafted and published a set of software citation principles that started with the Force 11 data citation principles and then updated them for software because, as everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, software is not data, and it's fairly different, even though it can be stored as data. But yes. So anyhow, so we wrote a paper about this, and we had 6 software citation principles, and of them, I think 3 to 4 of them are similar or almost identical to the data citation principles, but the others are not. And there's kind of reasons for those that I'm not going to get into in the short talk. But this is the principles themselves. And if you're familiar with the data citation principles, again, you'll see that these are similar, but not the same. And so then this software citation working group ended in April of 2017. And we immediately started a software citation implementation working group. With the 3 of us, as I said. And we published a document that's a set of software citation implementation challenges to try to document the work that we needed to do. And there's a lot of this work that's actually been going on, and I think we're doing a good job of coordinating a set of ongoing activities. And so just to talk about some of them, there's some work in metadata standards and translations. So DataCite's schema 4.1 had a bunch of software specific stuff that got added. Code Meta and citation.cff are 2 different ways of storing metadata about software in the software repository, so it can be picked up by other tools and automatically read. And these are, I think, going to be aligned with schema.org and at some point in the future, I hope. Yeah. There is interesting work that has started and is going on in terms of open source archiving and identification by Software Heritage. And if people haven't seen Software Heritage, it's definitely worth looking at. It's kind of like archive.org, but for GitHub and everything else. And so it's a nice collection of archiving all open source software over all time is their goal. And it's pretty interesting. There's also I think some good work in initial acceptance in some communities in astronomy and earth science and mathematics and maybe a few more. And we have published a few more documents. There's a software citation checklist for authors that we have version 0.9 of that's come out, and a software citation checklist for developers that also has come out. And there's a software citation checklist for reviewers that's under development. So we're trying to think about how do we actually get this idea into the hands of the people that need to do things with it. There's also a repositories task force for people that actually have software repositories to talk about good practices and what those practices are and to try to unify things around there a bit. And then we are starting a publisher task force this month. Actually, on Friday will be the first call of that task force to try to get publishers to start talking about what they actually need to do to make changes in their workflows and how we support them. So just to mention some concerns that we have and some things that are still kind of open questions. One is we want to have as much consistency as possible for different software types, whether the software is open source or closed source or an executable or a service. And it's not completely clear how we actually do this at this point. We also have the fact that the current guidance for open source, which is basically to deposit software in an archive and get a DOI, is basically aimed at treating software like papers and data, but that doesn't really match how software works and how open source works in particular. And so doing this is useful for the scholarly communications community because it matches the workflow that they expect, but it puts an extra burden on developers that have to do something that they're not used to doing that's not natural to them in the software world. And it also leads to questions about specificity and which particular software is being cited. And we could alternatively do things like using the software heritage IDs. And if we did that, we would need then to change developer culture so that people would record and maintain machine readable metadata in their repository, which is hard. But it would help archives get the correct metadata without developers having to insert it manually as they do now with Zenodo and with some other things. And it also would solve the specificity problem because people could cite exactly the commit that they were using at any time. But it's not what the scholarly communications community does now. And so there would have to be a lot of kind of culture change there. So I don't think we have a really good idea of which of these are right or if we should be trying to do both of them or something else. So this is, I think, one of the challenges that we have for the minute. And I wrote a blog post about this like at the end of December, just to talk about this. So if anybody's interested, we can talk about that as well. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a bunch of different related groups, and these are 3 different things that are related that I know of. One is the RDA Force 11 Software Source Code Identification Working Group. So if anybody will be in RDA in Melbourne in a couple of months, feel free to come to our working group there and talk about these things. The ESIP Software and Services Citations Cluster has certainly been leading and trying to take the things we've done up to this point and to push them out into more specific guidance and recommendations. And so this is something that we've been very happy to see and would like to see equivalents in other communities ideally. And then the last thing I think that's worth mentioning, or at least that I had thought of when I was putting together these slides, is that FAIR has become a really common word. And in my opinion, when FAIR was developed, it was developed for data, and it's now being used for a lot of other things without necessarily thinking about what it actually means for those other things. And so there is a group of people that have started working on what does FAIR mean for software, and we have a potential working group that might happen, and we'll have a talk coming up from that in after one more talk, and so there will be more details about that. So that's just a brief kind of update on citation of software for me. Any quick question before we go on to Shelley? Yeah.
Well, I guess this can also be followed up in the sustainability group if needed. But I know of people who think of software in a sense of a digital object, and therefore some of the FAIR things should apply to it, so it's accessible and so forth, easily accessible. And then talking about community practice changes, if you do something like that, well, there's a lot more data that requires a lot more identification compared to software. So it seems like, yeah, the data community has to change for this to help themselves. So why not also have the software community try to change?
Right. I mean, and I completely agree with that. I feel like we are in a lot of ways trying to ride on the coattails of data, but the fact that software is not data makes it unclear how far we can go with that. And if we're making the same culture change in 2 areas, or if we're making different culture changes at the same time. So I think that's one of the questions. I agree with you that any particular version of software certainly is a digital object that can have an identifier, but when the software is changing, I don't know, daily, does every individual commit get its own digital identifier, or do we talk about some in many areas we do, but I feel like traditionally data has been more static, although I agree that it certainly isn't always, and it's becoming less so. So anyhow, we can certainly talk about that. That would be great. Shelley Stahl is going to talk about some stuff that's been going on at AGU. And then we'll go back to the FAIR part after that. So this is the driving one.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Dan. It's really great to be able to talk to you guys. We've been working really closely with Dan and the folks at Force 11 to guide how AGU thinks about software citation. So my title at AGU is Senior Director of Data Leadership, but I have a huge software development background, so I feel really quite at home here in this room. So we within the work at AGU, as of August 1st, we require now that all of your data be cited within an appropriate repository with a reference within your paper. And when that comes to software, our editors said, we're not going to push a culture change for data, and knowing that you intend software to follow, we want to do it all at the same time. So not being sensitive to the fact that the community wasn't quite ready to support them on that. So I've dragged my feet a little bit, and thank goodness for the publications that came out from Force 11. Thank you so much for getting those out. That really helps, and now I can push forward. And still, we're not quite in sync, but good enough for the moment. So what does it mean in AGU to actually cite your software? So we need, please put in your availability state. So we're looking a lot like data. Yes, I know they're not the same, but at the moment, we're looking a lot like data. In your availability statement, indicate where your software is. And then please put a reference for your software in the reference section. And we can have an argument on what software we're talking about. That I would refer you to the Force 11 documents for what's the best thing to actually cite. And then within your methodology, if software was that important to your research, you're likely going to describe how it's working. So that's the idea here. And there are the two citations for the papers that are out for the checklist for authors and developers that came out of Force 11 that have helped guide us with this thinking. So we have author guidelines on our pages for data at the moment, and in development is a similar set for software citation. This has been incredibly difficult to write because we want there to be enormous amount of information, but we're not quite at that space yet. So we're going to start with what we can do. And I would put it up there, but it's currently under review. Coming out of the Force 11 review, heading into AGU editor review, probably in the next few minutes as soon as I push it their direction. I haven't quite done that yet, but just watch for that. If you have any interest in seeing what that text looks like, I'm more than happy to get additional comments going further. One of the things that we're fully aware of is quite a lot of development happens within GitHub. If we can figure out how to cite repository versions, releases within GitHub, then we have a lot of what we need within the publishing community to work. Having been to a variety of workshops on what that means, how that works with other repositories, other situations, software heritage, there's more to it. But when it comes to a researcher saying to you, is it okay for me to cite my GitHub repository? No, hell no, it's not. Stop thinking like that. That's not a persistent place. It's not an archive, but please use the Zenodo connection that gets you your DOI. So we're going to focus on that as a primary piece of information to get to the researchers. And of course, there's more to it. Sorry, I said that bad word. So there's also within the work from the Enabling Fair Data project, a series of frequently asked questions that we've put together. These have already aged. They're already not terribly useful. We will have an editorial board coming together. A lot of publishers point to these, so we can't just change the text without getting a full-blown approval process. But we will bring an editorial board together. We'll go ahead and do the updates, and the work coming out of Force 11 and the ESO community and the RDA community will weigh in heavily on what those additional questions and answers should be. This is a little easier to change than the commitment statement coming in from the Enabling Fair Data project. This is the page that we have for authors for data within AGU, and there's text in there that talks about availability statements, data citation, how to pick a repository, and specific for modeling data where we do talk somewhat about software. I won't get into those details, but comments on this directly to me are helpful. This is meant to be succinct, really quick for authors to understand, and then the software version will likely look rather similar to this. It doesn't make sense to push this together. It makes sense to keep it separate. I hope you agree on that. There really are two different kinds of things. Thanks. So just to clarify.
When you say this is AGU, you mean how AGU publications are handling this issue?
Right, two hats. So Enabling Fair Data International Solution, what is AGU doing?
Yeah, that's what I want to make clear, that this is not the whole of AGU, it's AGU publications.
Right, so Enabling Fair Data, what we stated was get your data citations in the journals as a mandatory path. Please do your best with software. When we introduce that to the editors within AGU, this woman's been dealing with smoke in Australia, please forgive her. So when we introduced that to the editors at AGU, they said, we're not doing 2 culture changes, we're doing 1, it's all data and software. And they asked for the information for software right away, and we're now getting that to them.
How much are you dealing with data and software coming in together with some of the submissions coming in, where it's really both? Maybe data is the point, but it's got a lot of software associated with it.
Yeah, because we don't have guidance for our editors yet, we haven't given them that, we haven't hit that yet. They haven't looked at the papers for that sort of analysis. So for instance, one area where software really matters is in the modeling community. So the reason the data section has information about modeling is because, frankly, output from a model is not as important as the software that is that model. So that's what we say in that section. So certainly for this group, that would be the part that I would have you take a look at. We worked really closely with the editors of James, the journal that's specific to modeling, in order to get the text for that right. What's possible within the community varies. Not every modeling team has access to the best version control to be able to cite a particular release, but they maybe have put it into a paper, and that's the best we can do. So we give options. Here's the best option. This is okay too. You know, if you must, please do, you know, this is all right, but, you know, try to improve, sort of thing. So for modeling, that's definitely the case where data is actually optional.
Yeah. So I'd just be very brief, but I would say that, you know, the best processing step metadata is software that does the processing steps. And there's a whole class of software, research software, that is one-off, one-built, hopefully using libraries, but is made to build data. And that stuff needs to have a sustainability plan associated with it in terms of where it goes. And hopefully we're considering that in the community.
Yeah. So I was going to just very quickly just mention that there's a lot of different activities that are going on with this as well. So there's questions about how do you cite notebooks, for example, that have both data and software, and how do you cite complex research objects? So I think this is a big question that I don't think there's a good answer for yet, but there's a lot of different people that are looking at it from different aspects. I wanted to then have the last of these quick sustainability talks is going to be from Annalena and Carlos, who are just finished a workshop in the Netherlands, and so they're in the Netherlands, and it's getting late there, so we'll hopefully let them talk for a few minutes. So go ahead, guys.
Hi, Dan. Thanks. We'll try to stick to 5 minutes.
It's going to be a bit of a challenge. So the plan for what we thought to, we rushed through a bit of a summary of a paper that was published or pre-published last autumn. So the important thing for you maybe to remember is this DOI, so you can look up all the details, and we're trying to get a very brief summary of what we, the insights that we put into that paper and about fair software. So you mentioned before that like, FAIR principles have been around for a while. Mostly they have been communicated and promoted for data, and then the questions arise really: how does it apply to? How does all this apply to software, and how we should do? And in this paper we summarize the current state of the discussion around FAIR and software, which is still ongoing, and also you are going to contribute in the sessions, and more working groups, and so as Dan mentions, are coming up on that. One important insight maybe around the scope of what FAIR for software can actually mean is this discussion: is software data or is software not data? And we say it is and it is not. So many people, what you often hear is a sentence of software is a special kind of data. And that is true if you take this really traditional view on data as sequences, as ones and zeros, as in theoretical computer science and hardware, where you say, okay, information, instructions, software, everything is essentially a sequence of ones and zeros in memory. But when we look at a more conceptual view that we take in FAIR and in research in general, we talk about research objects, digital objects, it's more this one that has already been indicated. So everything is digital objects and their data is something next to software. They might share some properties like the possibility of having a DOI assigned, but then what they do can differ quite a lot, and we need to distinguish between the two. Research software we mentioned here. An interesting thing to note here is that traditionally a lot of research software is free and open source software, so open licenses are important. But it's important to note that FAIR does not require data and also software to be open. And it's one of the questions if FAIR should actually require open software licenses or not. We don't have the answer to that one yet. Another thing that we highlight in the paper is that there's always this tension between FAIR, is this enough for software? Because what does it say about quality? And actually, you can see clearly that FAIR is not about quality in form of the content, or does only cover quality criteria to some extent, because FAIR is really focusing on the form of how something is provided, both for data and for software. So for software, this can mean FAIR can say something about code quality, maintainability, and some of also of the sustainability aspects in that sense. But it doesn't look at the quality of the content, in that sense, functionality of the software. And so FAIR doesn't help at all when it comes to functional correctness, software security, computational efficiency, and such things. So it has just not been made for that. Well, so after clarifying these things, we went on in the paper with the actual exercise, and Carlos is going to say something about that.
Yeah, so what we did in our paper, it was to take the FAIR principles as they are applied to data and say, okay, do these FAIR principles apply to research software or not? Some of them, for instance, having a persistent identifier, it's something that also is applicable to software. So as long as you have a DOI for where you can find your software, that already gives you, gets you a long way in being able to find the software, at least being able to find the source of the software that you're using. So that's a principle that, as it applies to data, it applies in a very similar fashion to software. And for all of the FAIR findable principles and the accessibility principles, they're very similar for software and for data. So most of them were rephrased. For the interoperability part is where things get more interesting and more difficult. And some of the things that apply to data actually don't make any sense for software. So we had to discard some of the principles that were applied for data, and we had to sort of rephrase or craft new principles that are applicable to software. So again, for sake of time, we're not going to go into detail of all the new principles, but we invite you to read the paper and to send us your comments if you want. And again, for the R principles also, most of it makes sense already. So I think the bulk of the work that is most interesting is in the interoperability part. So more details on what we discussed in the paper are about tooling that is available for FAIR software, and some of the next steps that we want to take in the direction of making software a FAIR object. And I'm going to skip through the acknowledgements. So yeah, so it's an ongoing debate. There's still a lot of work to do to make really the FAIR principles applicable to software and to really make software findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. But there's a lot of activity going in this area. So it's actually really an exciting time and exciting area to be working on, and it really feels like it's a roller coaster of activity. So we'll be happy to hear comments, to hear how your thoughts on this line. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions or comments quickly before we move on to the other part of the short talks, which aren't ending up being as short as I thought they were going to be? I will say that one question that came up just in discussion, just in the break before the session is the comment that there's technology readiness levels that have been developed for software. And think about, do the TRLs for software potentially match any kind of fair measurement that we might make for software, and what overlap might there be? So I think that would be something that would be interesting to talk about potentially if we do have a working group that goes forward.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, just I wouldn't have a spontaneous answer to that, how to match that, but it's certainly interesting to discuss. Yeah.
Sorry, and one question in the back, if get the microphone so both people can hear.
So you might be interested to know that the NASA Earth Science Data System Working Group on Software Reuse had developed some reuse readiness levels based on the technology readiness levels back in 2010. And so they're available from NASA. And they're very similar to the technology readiness levels in terms of the 9x9 matrix, but there are different categories and different criteria within each category.
Okay, yeah, so that would be something that would be good for some of us to look at least. So reuse readiness levels, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that would be interesting to look into as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Leslie at this point. If her voice holds out, we'll continue. So thanks. Not sure how we, let's see.
It's behind.
No, hang on. Do you know how this?
Oh, there we go. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah. Sorry, one sec. It's the okay, and then I just want there actually, because we want to record the full screen. That's the difficulty. Can you present here? Is that okay? Yeah. Were you guys okay to just see this? I'm not sure how to make it vote. Okay.
Okay, I hope I last this. My voice suffered a bit from a bit of a smoke overdose in Canberra on the weekend. It's nice to be here in the fresh air and also to get away from irate researchers in Australia who are having trouble with publications because publishers are actually starting to demand not just for data but also for software that they have it in a repository. And so really I just wanted to give some recent initiatives that I've been part and ask whether we're ready. And some of it's already been covered. So I just want you to realize I'm going to come up a level. And so Shelley already talked about what AGU is doing, but I don't think you all may understand fully the drivers for why they're doing it. And this was AGU had this grant to align repositories to enable fair and open data, create workflows, will have a simplified experience when submitting their paper to any journal. This is really important. That was why I asked Shelley, are you speaking for AGU or AGU publishers? And the idea was that we would accelerate scientific discovery by enable integrity, transparency of data. Now, data includes data, software, and samples. That is not saying they are the same. And I've got physical samples there, which there's no way I'm going to say a physical rock is the same as data, even though you're starting to hear this, but data is not software. It is an input to research. Okay, and that is what we're trying to capture and make transparent. And this is a list of people that participated in it, including 3 Australian groups. And data are no longer, bearing in mind, we're saying your software, it's not a supplement, okay? And that it has to be in a scientific repository, which for a lot of us with software is GitHub. And again, see that data, samples and software at the high level are documented, identified with persistent identifiers. And that researchers need to know how to be able to do this. So I can already see that within this group, you're starting to document how you're going to do it for software, which won't be the same as for data or for samples, but we're understanding now this driver for the publishers. And I have never had anything that has started to motivate researchers from a data world in thinking about this than what has happened in this paper, particularly for what we call the long tail researchers who only have small data sets. Up until now, that's been the worst managed. And so now they're having to think about it. And I think the same philosophy is starting to creep through into software. And this is what Shirley talked about. And she just said there's 174 signatories. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it's not just AGU, there's quite a few other publications. And so we heard from Shelley what AGU is doing, and I asked for software, is that what Elsevier is doing? Is that what Wiley, is that what Nature are doing? They're fairly organised on, starting to get organised on what they're doing on data, but it's a can of worms with software, which is why groups like this are really important. So really I'm just sort of trying to give you an external view on why the work you're doing is so important. And here we go. This is the guidelines for data, where data means data software samples aligned with the FAIR principles. We can cite and link to the data, and we have an availability statement. So again, this is all things you're working towards, because this is now becoming an integral part of the publication process. You may not have heard this, but this was just released in November 2019, and it comes from CODATA, which is the data arm of the International Science Union. Again, the word data is used, and this is in the actual paper, to comprise data and the ecosystems of digital things that relate to data, including metadata software and algorithms and samples. So software is recognized as a first-class citizen of the research ecosystem. And it has 10 principles, and principle 5 is publicly funded should be interoperable and able to facilitate reuse in scientific research. And it specifically says software instruments and data format should be well documented and not propose any proprietary lock-in. Okay, so again, this kind of high-level theme is coming up. I'm not arguing that data and software are different. It's that you are considered as an input to research. I think another thing to think about is this new project, which is Software for 2030. I love this funding by the European Union for exascale in solid earth research, because as science, which is what we're all part of, is starting to scale up. And even though we don't have any exascale computers, they're starting to think about what an exascale software thing looks like for earth sciences. And let me assure you, that means you're now in the domain of the client sciences, which means that you're going to be doing community developed software, which then comes back to the point of how do we attribute people who are developing that software or who have contributed to that software in the past, because this will be at scale, and it's not just going to be a team of 2 or 3, it's going to be quite large. And I'm arguing that scaling of software and collaborative software will be the new norm. And as we move forward, particularly with this publication, etc., there are 2 key questions. How do we enable users to discover and access fit for purpose software? And I'd argue that software and some of the issues that have just been presented are similar to what I used to cope with data 20 years ago. And how do we ensure that publications cite the exact version of the software that was used with properly credited and all responsible authors who have contributed are somehow acknowledged along the way? And so that's really just a theme that we wanted to add to what this group is doing at the nuts and bolts, sort of give a framework or a concept of what I think also needs to be taken into account. Thanks.
Thanks for waiting.
Thanks, Leslie. Just to comment, so I'm going to introduce myself slightly differently. Peter Fox, Editor-in-Chief of AGU's Earth and Space Science Journal. I'm at the bullseye of a lot of what Shelley described and what Leslie's starting to get at, but it's maybe a question for Dan and Leslie. First, a comment on what Leslie presented. There's a preponderance to use the word publisher as a catch-all, but it's really journals, editors, reviewers related to software, which is where the real friction is right now. You can say all the things that you want. I can tell you offline what I do as an editor-in-chief in enforcing FAIR for data and software and everything that goes with it, and it looks quite different to what you've all put up here. But we don't think in the journal and the publication data policy about acts of sustainability. It's preservation, and it's a 5-year period. That's AGU's policy. The data only has to exist in a place for 5 years. That's the current. That might change. At the editor-in-chief retreat in the end of February, this is going to be a major topic for consideration. So this is terrific input to that. But I'm sort of wondering now for Dan, what you're thinking in terms of, because it's the software sustainability that you're talking about. Sustainability is not the word I use for a journal person. I understand that reuse implies that the software has to still be around and maybe you can access it, but I'm wondering what you're trying to get your hands around here. I think it's great, but just in terms of reality of, Shelley and I going to AGU in an hour or two's time to meet with the publications and journal staff about exactly this.
Can I actually say I fully agree with you? To me, it's the editors and it's the reviewers that are really struggling with this. And I can't see consistency across the journals. So I probably shouldn't have used the word publication, I meant journals. I think we have issues in data which are really bubbling to the surface, and software's just sitting there to the side and you see it's going to hit that next. And so all I was trying to do was just raise it. Please think this through. That again, your 5-year rule is great. In Australia, under the Archives Act, it's 7 years. Yeah, how do we know the version of the software that was used in terms of reproducibility or replication, whatever you want to call, that goes with that paper, 1, and 2, how do the people that develop the bit that goes with the paper get the accreditation? And I'm really throwing this up as an issue and I don't know the answers.
Yeah, so before Dan comments, you've prompted me to, a bit I left out is AGU journals, not all of them, but many of them have embraced project credit, which does include, and we capture that at submission time. We're not using it in any effective way. Topic for this afternoon with, it's on the agenda. Our VP for pubs and I have been talking about this. Project credit's worth looking at to make sure that the points you mentioned about credit for software is properly unpacked. because sometimes it really isn't. But it just prompted me to think about one other thing. Please get this material translated into other languages, especially Mandarin, because I spend about half my time responding to Asian authors who do not understand, well, they don't understand what's written. They certainly don't understand my Australian version of what is written. And I have people in Wiley having to translate my emails into Mandarin, for example, so that I can actually get them to respond to the policies. And so just a plea for, as you're developing this, think about the communities that you're trying to reach. I think it'll go a long way to greater adoption, because the Asian force is a very responsive one right now and could be a major, showcase for how you do this stuff.
I guess on my side of this, so I'm one of the associate editors in chief of the Journal of Open Source Software, and so we're trying to do things there that are somewhat different, and we have the advantage of starting off new and not being kind of burdened by decades of bad IT and other things. But I guess when I think about how we as a community can influence the publication system, it seems like working through the publishers is in some senses kind of the hour of the neck of the hourglass, where we have a way of dealing with a small group of people that then can broadcast it out to a larger group of people. And so the little bit of this that I've done has been more with IEEE and ACM, not with HEU. But there we have I guess in ACM in particular, a group that brings in representatives from a lot of the different conference proceedings editors and journal editor-in-chiefs, and tries to work out together what's the right workflow that's going to match the ACM systems and enable different types of objects, including data and software, to be reviewed and to be cited. And so from the point of view of the Force 11 group, I don't think that we can work with all of the editors directly, but we view the publishers as a way of working with the editors indirectly. Maybe that's not good, I don't know. The other thing I was going to say is just back on the software citation part. When we wrote the software citation principles, we thought fairly carefully about use cases and what we were trying to do, and we focused on the use case of citation for credit. And we specifically did not go into the use case of citation for reproducibility. Because it actually is a fairly different set of requirements with some overlap, but certainly not the same things. And so I think that the question of reproducibility is beyond what I've been trying to talk about in terms of citation here. Identification is part of it, but identification is only a part of it.
Again, I'm glad Peter's here, because yesterday I just want to pick up on what you said, working with the publishers, the editors, or the reviewers, because we had a similar meeting because we've got a bit of a crisis developing with data as well with these new rules. The rubber is hitting the road. And at the data session yesterday, we were actually asking the question, Peter, is it the publishers we work with or is it the editors we work with? Because it's two different things. And we feel that to really help the rubber hit the road without going up in smoke, it's more the editors we need to start working with. And again, that's just raising, because you actually started saying publisher and then you went to editor.
So I guess just before Peter takes the microphone out of my hand, okay. All right. I was just going to repeat that from our point of view, it's just a question of where can we get the leverage to make the change that we want? Because we can't, I don't think that we ourselves can make a change for how all reviewers are going to do reviews. The reviewers are going to do things based on what the journals tell them ideally and maybe what other reviewers tell them, maybe what the community kind of comes up with over time, maybe what the editor says. Sometimes they're just going to ignore all that and do what they think they used to do 20 years ago as well. So it's a little bit hard to do, but we feel like the best way that we can try to provide leverage is by working through the publishers and having the publishers try to work with the editors and trying to change the policies that are written and then having that flow down to the reviewers. Whether or not that's really going to be effective, I don't know, but that's the path we've chosen to try.
So this is great. I cannot speak for AGU. Shelley can, but I can't. I'll maybe just give a bit of a perspective, and that's based on my very positive experience with, one slice of sort of a strange, now strange publishing endeavor, which is AGU has a publications division group, but they're not the publisher. And so there's this actually nice opportunity to have a very tight conversation between the editors and the AGU staff on behalf of the professional society, which is AGU, the members. And then the engagement with Wiley, yeah, we sort of, we tell them what to do. Thank you for saying that, giving me the words. But that's a different model from many other quote publishers, and I see where the ones that Dan mentioned, especially it's not quite the same relationship. Maybe it is with ACM and wherever you go through. And I've been on many other editorial boards, and I think I'm glad you mentioned use cases, because it really is, what problem are we trying to either solve or address that should feed the conversation, rather than we need software citation or we need this or we need that. Because we do rely on the publishers to implement things in the interfaces, data that we need to collect and checkboxes and all sorts of things like that. So it's really got to be a partnership. And I guess one thing I'll just finish by saying is the FAIR thing has moved fairly quickly. I think it's moved much more quickly than we as a journal or me as an editor, or certainly the community of authors has been able to keep up with. And what Shelley said about the editors going, whoa, 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 culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And we have to be very careful if you really want this to truly make it a change. You need to be just deliberate enough about it. I'd love it to be incremental, but I don't know that we're going to get incremental. AGU sort of had an incremental approach with a data policy, but then FAIR came in and everything's moving really quickly. And it's really a challenge for me as an editor. I gave a talk in Vienna on this. And I said, I'm going to do the right thing by my responsibilities to the journal and to the authors. It's not to this.
Sorry, so just one last comment, because it came up before, I think, in Peter's comment. So Project Credit is now something like probably 6 years old. I don't know if that's exactly right, but something like that. And the way that they divided up roles was based on machine learning from how people self-described their roles in biomedical publications. And it's not completely clear that that actually is right for other fields, and that the credit model is completely the right thing. So there is some discussion about redoing that. There's a group led by Northwestern that's trying to build in a second layer underneath that, because actually right now, if somebody works on software, everybody that works on software shows up in one box that says software. And maybe there should be some finer resolution there. Maybe there should be finer resolution for data as well, for maybe data curation, data cleaning, I don't know, a few other things. So there is work going on with that. Partly, maybe Castray will still be involved. I don't know for sure. And I don't remember the name of the project at Northwestern, but but there are a few different interesting things going on. I think being discussed at RDA in particular. Okay, so sorry, so this has all been a little bit more talking and general discussion than I thought. Let's try to get into some smaller groups at this point. So we talked about two groups initially, one for sustainability, one for discoverability and accreditation. Can I see if that would work by people putting up their hands for first sustainability? And then second for discoverability and accreditation? Okay, I think that looks reasonable then. So why don't, how will we do this? How about if the sustainability side comes up here, and we'll bring some chairs and have a little circle, and the other side will kind of go back there somewhere maybe? I think a circle would probably be better, but let's see how we do with numbers. So, yeah. So I think if anybody's online, I don't think it's going to be very easy to participate. So I would say thank you to people online, and maybe this is the end of the online part of the session. Yeah.